Once upon a time, the provincial government that was most likely to fight the federal government in Ottawa would have been found in the province of Quebec. That is no longer the case. Look west, young man, look west. That is the new battlefront for at least the current Trudeau Liberal government. Hello and welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. And today we're taking a look westward towards Saskatchewan, towards the land of the open skies. Or is that the big skies? We'll ask our guest, John Gormley, about that. He is a former MP for the Battlefords area, but that was a long time ago. And in between then and now, he had a 25-year radio career across Saskatchewan, taking the pulse of the province. He joins me now. John, thanks for the time.
Brian, always great to be here. And it's land of the living skies.
Land of the living sky. I should know these things. I really should. But let's talk about this change. When you were in Ottawa 2 lifetimes ago, the battle was always between Ottawa and Quebec City. Now it's between Ottawa and Edmonton, or Ottawa and Regina. That's a big shift, isn't it?
It is, but in many ways, my brief political career, and I always say it ended because of ill health. The voters got sick of me after 4 years. The time in Ottawa was very much a Quebec orientation, but that was also at the end of my career, 1988, the first election, the Reform Party ran candidates in. Within 5 years, the Reform Party had carved out pretty clearly the West wants in message. So there's been this growing sense of Western alienation, particularly with Mr. Trudeau, open, unbridled hostility to the West. So it should be no surprise that the single largest unit, which of course is the area contiguous Saskatchewan next to Alberta, take that area, you've got a GDP of Norway, you've got the 5th largest oil producer on Earth, the largest potash producer on Earth, the second largest uranium producer on Earth. So take Alberta and Saskatchewan as a united region. We punch well above our weight, and Mr. Trudeau significantly hasn't just held us back, he's actually gone hunting for us in many cases, and there's a frustration.
When we had Scott Moe on the podcast a while ago, we talked about the famous cartoon, The Milk Cow. That's more than 100 years old. And for people that haven't seen it, it's a cow grazing in Western Canada while people milk it and take all the riches in Eastern Canada. And that's very much Trudeau's attitude towards the West, isn't it?
It is very much. I mean, he wants, and I'm never sure with Mr. Trudeau, the level of strategy and how long, you connect those beads. I mean, if part of the specific strategy is to bring Western Canada into behaving better by limiting our oil and gas, limiting our mining potential, putting us in our place, that's not going to happen. I don't know if he's that strategically advanced or if in the short term obsession with clean energy policy, a number of these 2030 and 2035 dictates, if that's, but we are clearly the casualty of that.
What you just described there reminded me of the old saying, beatings will continue until morale improves. That seems
Yes.
to be his thinking on that. So there's a new element of this $42 million fight, but that's over paying the carbon tax on home heating fuels that Saskatchewan refused to collect. I want to get to the court fight in that in a moment, but you mentioned his obsession with clean energy and clean fuels and climate change. He's been down in Washington for the NATO meetings over the last week. He's trying to say that some of our defense spending or some of our climate change spending has to count towards defense because climate change is a major national security issue. That's the level of obsession. I mean, none of the other countries, as far as I know, are doing this. And most of them are all committed to lowering greenhouse gas emissions. He's the one saying, we're going to count this.
Well, if Greta Thunberg is helping him make policy, and I suspect sometimes when he speaks this way, she might be, that's, again, a rational in Trudeau world response. It's rational in nobody else's world. And many of the efforts that will continue to reduce the largest emitters of CO2, which are industrial, can be done by adaptation, can be done by innovation, can be done a number of ways. Canada has doubled down on taxing citizens for everything, and it hasn't worked. And I know we'll talk about the Saskatchewan standoff. It's not going to work.
Yeah, let's talk about that standoff. Court injunction at this point. It's not a full victory, but it's a temporary victory, and that is the federal government came and tried to essentially garnish $42 million out of the treasury of Saskatchewan. And the court said, oh, wait, hang on. You can't do that.
You can't. And as a lawyer, I watch this, and I think, first of all, let's take the step, let's pull it all the way back to division of powers. Section 91, Section 92 of the Constitution Act of 1867, formerly the British North America Act, the Supreme Court of Canada allowed Ottawa to move into an area of taxation that constitutionally they were not permitted to, because climate change and the overheating of the planet was something that wasn't contemplated in 1867. It gave Ottawa the ability to fill that void or move in what was called peace, order, and good government to regulate something it ought not to regulate. In other words, taxing citizens that way.
It was a very weak decision that hung on peace, order, and good government.
On its face, a number of constitutional scholars would think the court got it wrong, but let's assume the court got it right. Once you then start to apply that tax, if you're still and getting offside in new ways under the Constitution, does a province simply say, oh, well, you're allowed to levy the tax, so now I have to pay the tax, when you tell one part of the country that over half the people who pay the tax don't pay the tax anymore?
Yeah, maybe we should back up and unpack this a bit. Of course, the fight over this $42 million is because after the Trudeau government was facing plummeting poll numbers in Atlantic Canada, they decided that they would not charge the carbon tax on home heating oil. Now, they say that this is an across the country national move. And yes, you can find a few people in Ontario. I think it's about 1% to 2% of the population use home heating oil, mostly in rural areas. You can find a few people in Saskatchewan and in Alberta, but where are they mostly? They're in Atlantic Canada. And so this was a partisan political party decision dressed up as, public policy. Scott Moe, Premier Saskatchewan, looked at this and said, well, if they're not paying it, our people aren't paying it. And the reason you guys can do that is because you're all communists in Saskatchewan and you still own an energy company, right? Sask Energy is the main supplier of natural gas. And he's not charging it on that. So that's what the fight is over.
Absolutely. And here's the other issue. Natural gas is, in terms of the way you generate BTUs of heat, is still one of the most effective methods of heating. In Ontario, home heating oil, of course, is the highest producing of CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions. So the Atlantic has always been way offside. So Mr. Trudeau says, well, I'll incent you by not charging it anymore. In other words, I'll allow you to keep per unit of energy, quote, polluting. I can't use the word pollute and carbon dioxide in the same sentence, but I shall, because
That's how Trudeau says, yeah.
The Atlantic are multiples greater polluters than Saskatchewan, and they get a free pass. So they're not going to be charged as long as they continue to pollute. And then the incentive will be to move you to heat pumps. Well, heat pumps run purely on the electrical grid. How do you produce that electricity? Well, in the Atlantic, you produce it by natural gas and a bit of coal. So let's get this circuit. It's like electric vehicles. We should all drive electric vehicles and generate twice as much electricity as we need by using fossil fuels. So there, again, in the internal Trudeau world of this bizarre cult, this somehow makes sense. So now I'm the Premier of Saskatchewan. I look at this and say, we lost on Ottawa allowing peace, order, and good government to levy a tax. Do we have a duty when that tax is unfairly applied in one region? Yes, we do. So to the people on the political left who are doing this, well, it's the law. you don't get to opt out of income tax. Well, the federal government doesn't take a region of the country and say, you don't get to pay any income tax, everybody else does. If Ottawa did that, you'd have other provinces saying, we don't pay the income tax here.
Oh, I'd be opting out of income tax if they did that.
Bingo.
Uh, the So something you said in that leads me to another area of the fight. Scott Moe, Danielle Smith have both said that they will use all their powers to fight Bill C-59. This is the one that it's a budget or implementation bill. It's for the fall economic statement, but it includes provisions that the oil and gas industry is incredibly worried about. In fact, some of the lobby groups for the oil and gas industry took pretty much everything down off their website and social media because they're worried about being prosecuted for false statements. And some of the supporters of the Trudeau government say, well, then they shouldn't make false statements. Except who's the arbiter of what the false statement is? You mentioned that natural gas burns cleaner. Charlie Angus of the NDP had a bill before Parliament, still does, calling for that to be made illegal to say, well, natural gas burns cleaner than oil. Even though it does, he says you shouldn't be allowed to say it because you're greenwashing. People are worried that this new power given to the Competition Tribunal is going to see statements like that prosecuted. And sure, it won't be prosecuted criminally, but it's going to be prosecuted through a judicial process where you can face millions of dollars in fines. That is utter insanity.
It is completely. But is it any less insane than a similar regulatory proceeding on two different legs that they want to bring in to the internet? The idea that one can regulate speech, one can regulate certain commentary. So we live in a Canada today, and even though we haven't had the robust kind of free speech that America has under the First Amendment, we had a pretty good Canadian consensus on what constituted free speech. Under this government, whether it's their favorite hobby horse of the climate panic and crisis, or it's the attempt to regulate the media and the internet, we're living in a Canada that the sense of free speech is completely diluted, gone.
When I'm out in your neck of the woods, when I'm out in Sask, I hear about these things all the time. People are very concerned about the erosion of basic liberties. What do you hear when you're out? I know you're not doing open line call every day anymore. You're back to practicing a bit of law and a bit of being a semi-retired man and golfing. But what do you hear when you're on the golf course, when you're in the coffee shops, in the restaurants? What do people tell you?
I think there's a bit of a division. People who care deeply about the country and think a little see this being the precursor on a lot of fronts to a Canada that no one ever imagined would be this way. And again, so much for Mr. Trudeau's post-national state. It's again, did he sit down 9 years ago and map out this kind of inexorable decline in Canada? Or was this simply a set of unintended consequences? I don't know the answer. That's a group that, I hang with some in that group. Others, when you look at the carbon tax, when you look at inflation, when you look at interest rates, affordability is a huge issue. In fact, the Angus Reid Institute poll just out last night does canvass this idea of, am I struggling? Well, Saskatchewan is among the top level of people who are struggling. And we don't have $1 million house average prices. Our houses are quite affordable here, but we drive more. We have the same impact on interest rates. Affordability is affecting particularly younger families in a lot of pretty important ways.
On that housing front, one of the Conservative MPs put out an infographic the other day showing what percentage of your income you need to pay for an average home in all kinds of places. And it's the first time I thought maybe I should move to Regina. I think it was about 25%. Here in Toronto, it's 78%. In Vancouver, it's over 100% of the average income to pay for an average home. So look, do you think that the disconnect between Western Canada, and I'll call it Central Canada, because really we're not east. We're in the middle of the country here in Ontario and in Quebec. And that's the power base. And that's who the politicians try and placate. Do you think the antipathy, the antagonism that comes from the government and many in the media is because they just don't understand it? They've never done what I did last fall, drove from Saskatoon out to Coutts, Alberta. You see a different way of life, not just in the city, but, I couldn't tell you how many cows I saw, how many oil jacks. It is vastly different than a downtown Toronto or downtown Ottawa life, a downtown Montreal life, vastly different. And the people making the decisions, be they elected officials or bureaucrats, simply don't know what it's like out in a place like Saskatchewan.
That's very true. I mean, it's popular, of course, in America to refer to bi-coastalism. If you live in New York, you live in LA, you have an entirely different value set than the so-called flyover states, states you fly over on your way between New York and LA. In this country, there is, of course, the famous Laurentian area. So pick whether it's a Laurentian triangle, the Laurentian section, but pick Ottawa, pick Toronto, head over to Montreal, take all of the people inside that group, and then the extended suburb of the Laurentians, of course, is Vancouver. So if those are your policy setters, your official pundits, the people who comment for a living, the people who make policy for a living and get elected for a living, that does leave out a big chunk of this country. So that's really this is the Canada that we live in as Western Canadians.
And yet, even in this part of the country, all you have to do is drive up Highway 17 from Ottawa, up the valley, as they say. You get a very different point of view that's probably more in line with what you would get driving between Regina and Saskatchewan. You can drive up to St. Gabriel de Brandon in that section of Quebec, north of Three Rivers, and you're going to get a viewpoint that, again, much more similar to where you are. But the policy setters, as you say, all come from this one area, and they don't look at what you have to offer as being as valuable as what we have here.
Yep, absolutely. And of course, that wouldn't be problematic if inside that Laurentian triangle you didn't have the significant number of millions of Canadians and the number of seats. So again, this is how we accept Canada. And if I go back to when you asked me about my life in Ottawa in the 1980s, there was a strong sense of regional identity, but in the 80s, you were, as a Western Canadian, quite concerned about the cod fishery because, of course, it was in trouble. It later ended up closing down. As a Western Canadian, I gave a crap about the Atlantic. I was also concerned about the dairy sector in Quebec. I was concerned about forestry in BC because there was this sense that if you were to build a Canada in a compromise, you had to look out for certain regions. That's completely gone now.
Well, I was going to say, do you still get that sense?
No, not at all. The only reason the aforementioned point about Mr. Trudeau on home heating oil did what he did in Atlantic Canada was he had absolutely safe Liberal seats that were messaging him back in the Wednesday caucus meeting every week. Good grief, we're going to lose, and we're going to lose 20 seats in Atlantic Canada, and that's going to mean the Liberals are done. That was the precursor to what's been happening in recent months, where now the polling shows they're down everywhere. So, to the extent there was a regional concern, it was crass politics. When I was there, you were concerned about what constituted a Canadian identity. That doesn't exist anymore.
I want to ask you about Saskatchewan provincial politics in a bit. We'll do that after the break. But before we go to the break, let me ask you what's changed in Saskatchewan. You've got, 14 MPs. Every single one of them represents the Conservative Party, and that is not about to change. It used to be that there were New Democrat MPs from Saskatchewan. There were Liberal MPs. Ralph Goodale was lonely for a while, but what changed? Was it the attitude of the parties, the attitude of the people, a bit of both?
all of the above. I think in this, again, the Saskatchewan I was elected in, we had 9 Conservatives and 5 New Democrats. After the free trade election, we had 4 Conservatives and 10 New Democrats. So most of us were tossed out in 1988 over free trade, which was weird because the most trade dependent province in Canada is Saskatchewan. It
Mm-hmm.
was the strongest oppositional province on the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. So in those days, the NDP had a rural agrarian presence. The NDP was a much wider, more circulating party than they are today. Today, the NDP is very much an urban, very, very hard left-wing party, which causes them problems provincially in particular. But that would be the biggest distinction. The Tories have become a larger tent party. The NDP's become a smaller tent, and that's manifesting itself provincially.
What about the federal Liberals? I mean, they couldn't get elected dog catcher in Saskatchewan now.
No, there is no federal Liberal presence here, and Ralph Goodale was an outlier. It was explained to me, and I've often said this to anybody who's patient enough to listen. The week I arrived in Ottawa, an old political hand in the Conservative Party took me out. We went to a fancy dining room, and he looked at me and he said, "Son, you do know the 16% rule." And I said, "That rule would be," and I didn't have a clue what he meant. And he said, "When you're a new candidate elected, 84% of the votes you get, every 100 votes, 84 of them you got because of your leader, your party, its policies. You generated 16 of that 100." And he said, with every election, that 16 will grow. And I don't know if that was scientific or not, but it stuck with me because it's very true, particularly in national politics. Ralph Goodale took that 16, and by the time he was, the poor guy was just drowning. I mean, we've talked about the carbon tax. Ralph Goodale, who's a brilliant man, he was a gold medalist in law school. Ralph would look at the camera and actually try to explain that if only we could do away with all income tax, all provincial sales tax, the carbon tax would be the salvation of Saskatchewan. And people would listen to him and think, "Ralph, did you bump your head?" I mean, Ralph was trying to carry the Liberal message. His effectiveness, of course, had been he was a terrific local riding MP who probably got, out of every 100 votes, 80 were for Ralph. Of course, even that couldn't work because by the time Ralph was finally sent packing, Saskatchewan had said, "We just don't do Liberals anymore, and we're not going to."
Let's talk about provincial politics when we come back from the break in one of the many provinces where there is no provincial Liberal Party. It's a two-way race. We'll get into that in moments. So there's no Liberal Party provincially in Saskatchewan. It is a battle between the Saskatchewan Party and the NDP. Now, talk to us about the Saskatchewan Party for people that aren't stubble jumpers. If you're not a stubble jumper, you're hearing that name and you're saying, "I'm not sure what that is."
Well, it's an amazing testament to the Saskatchewan that I've lived my life in. I remember as a kid, the NDP was coming off a 20-year run, which had been the longest single uninterrupted run. Tommy Douglas gets elected in 44. The Liberal Party gets elected in 64. The NDP was everywhere. They were rural, they were urban, small businesses put NDP signs up. I mean, the NDP was a force of nature. They were a machine. But even in those days, I remember thinking, they don't win elections with over 50% of the vote. Tommy Douglas, I think, only twice had 50%. And then, of course, when the NDP in 71 sent the Liberals packing, they had over 50%. In 91, when the NDP sent the Tories packing, they had over 50%. But here was the natural governing party for 60 plus years that rarely ever had 50%. Why? You had Conservatives and Liberals who always split the remaining half of the vote. So the NDP, if Tommy Douglas's great parable was the black cats and the white cats. It was called Mouseland. And he talked about the wee mice. And he talked about the NDP and the people as wee mice. Did you ever hear this? And
No.
it was a famous parable. In fact, the NDP actually have it printed. You can buy it on the NDP website. They actually got Tommy Douglas narrating it. It's still for people who love ancient history, the parable of Mouseland and the wee mice. And of course, the funny part was those of us who have had mice, they crap everywhere and eat the wiring. I never signed up to be a mouse, but see, it was black cats and white cats. And the cats were always concerned only about eating the mice. So if you could have the black cats fighting with the white cats, the wee mice could continue to live unmolested. So that was the Douglas parable. It was the singular most effective political strategy uh, I've ever seen. 60 years it worked for the NDP. Conservatives and liberals fight. Ross Thatcher in 64 coalesces the non-NDP around him. He gets 2 terms. Grant Devine in 82, conservative. The Liberals collapse. He coalesces around him, the non-NDPers. He gets 2 terms. But invariably, the NDP knew when the mice came home, they would be governing Saskatchewan. So in 1997, 4 conservatives, and the conservatives are at a low ebb. They've been badly beaten in 91. The Liberals are on the ascent, but they've got a really quirky leader who's just not really hitting the right tone. 4 Liberals, 4 Conservatives create a thing called the Saskatchewan Party. The Conservatives collapse, the Liberals collapse. The Sask Party is the people who aren't NDPers. And lo and behold, what happens when all of the non NDP mice get together in one party? They win in '07. Not a big win. Brad Wall wins only 10 seats more than the NDP, 12 seats. 2011, he demolishes them down to a dozen seats in a 60-seat House. 2016, 2020, now 24. So the Sask Party this fall will have been governing for 17 uninterrupted years. Unthinkable in Saskatchewan if you aren't the NDP.
So, what's going to happen in the coming election? The Moe government, one of my favorite sayings in politics is eventually the voters get sick of your face. That's the illness factor that you were alluding to earlier in your career. Voters just get sick of your face, or they want change. Is Brad Moe, is Scott Moe's government in danger of voters saying, you know what, we're going to give the NDP a try? The NDP have had a few hapless leaders, to put it mildly. They seem to be on a better footing now, but I'm looking at this from afar. What do you see?
The other point of when the NDP comes back, they have usually crafted a bigger tent. And again, they get close. In fact, both in 71 and 91, they actually got over 50% of the vote. So they had people so frustrated with the Liberals in the 60s, Tories in the 80s, that they said, I'm voting for the NDP. We're not at that point in Saskatchewan. The NDP has certainly been in the ascent, and some of that is exactly as you've talked about, Brian, fatigue. This is nearly a 20-year government. That's a long run. Alan Blakeney, the great NDP premier of the 70s, put it even better. He said, the day you get elected, they give you a backpack. And every day they put a pebble in the backpack. And there comes a time when you can't keep walking with that backpack. So every government, and usually governments go about 10 years before the backpack becomes too heavy. The Sask Party brand isn't really affected much. In the cities, the NDP is typically stronger in the cities. They've had a bit of a rally. They've had a renaissance. The final part of that test is if the NDP come back in the cities, you look at the NDP caucus and you say, who in these people could be the new ministers of a new government? At this point in Saskatchewan, I'm not sure Carla Beck is a premier. I sort of start losing count on cabinet material at about 4. So the NDP are growing, but they're not a threat yet. I warn Sask Party people, if the Sask Party are reelected this fall, which is quite likely, 4 years hence, if the Sask Party hasn't done a major reset, a major urban policy, major initiatives to be new, By that time, there'll be a 21-year-old government, and they will likely find themselves being replaced.
You mentioned Carla Beck. She's the leader of the NDP. She represents a Regina riding, so that's the urban part that you were talking about. But she does have farm roots, like an awful lot of people in the cities in Saskatchewan. Is she able to speak to those voters? Some of the other leaders say they couldn't talk to anybody off of 2nd Avenue in Saskatoon. Is she able to reach out into small town farming communities, the places that where more seats are?
She is certainly better than the past four NDP leaders. It was funny. I drove through Francis, Saskatchewan twice last week, and all I kept thinking as I pulled up to Francis was, Carla Beck's from Francis, because she opens every single speech, urban or rural, as a girl from Francis, and then talks about growing up on a farm. The bigger test, though, and a friend of mine who is as I am, a political junkie, says, "Snap quiz. Who's the NDP ag critic?" I don't have a clue. I had to look it up. By the way, it's a city MLA named Trent Wotherspoon, who's the longest serving MLA in the NDP. He's a school teacher from Regina. But the NDP can't tell people who their critic is, never mind what's their policy. So, until and unless, and in Saskatchewan, here's an insider's tip, the NDP, if they're going to win seats, it'll be Regina and Saskatoon, sometimes more weighted Regina, I think, as they are today, Saskatoon secondly. The evolution begins when they start winning the two Prince Albert seats and the two Moose Jaw seats. Then you've got the second or the third level of cities after Moose Jaw and PA. You've got North Battleford, Lloydminster, Estevan, Weyburn, Melfort. You've got those communities. And in the past, Yorkton, in the past, those communities were able to sustain NDP MLAs. In those ridings, the NDP doesn't even show up.
They don't represent Weyburn, the home of Tommy Douglas?
The home of Tommy Douglas and the home of the Bakken oil play and oil production in Saskatchewan, which has been so beaten up by the left and the obsession over pipelines and climate change that no, you couldn't get a new Democrat elected dog catcher in Weyburn today.
Is it also still the home of the KFC buffet?
That one may have passed.
Okay.
Humboldt and Weyburn had all-you-can-eat KFC buffets, which was a well-kept secret in many parts of Saskatchewan because we didn't want other people in.
Well, it sounds good, but then you're going to pay for it later.
Or you ever.
So let's talk about two of the issues that have dogged the Sask Party, and I want to ask you if they've damaged them enough to, give Scott Moe pause for concern, because there was a poll out. I'm just going to pull it up here. This would have been early to mid-February. And I'm forgetting the name of the firm now because it's not on this chart, but it's a Saskatchewan firm. It had the NDP at just within 2 points of the Sask Party in February. And I asked friends in the polling industry, and they said, no, it's a viable and reputable firm. Since then, the Sask Party has bounced back, but that was in the middle of a fight with the teachers. And, people will complain about the school system, what have you, but they like their kid's teacher. Did they misplay with the teachers, and has that been settled out? What was the issue there?
It was a complicated issue, and of course, there are layers and layers underneath it. The teachers, the last four contract negotiations, certainly three of them actually resulted in labor action. The teachers' union president for a couple of those disputes was a former NDP candidate, a guy named Patrick Mays. The teachers, again, like any big union, you've got average rank and file, great teachers who go to work every day. You've got a union executive and leadership that is as or more left wing than the Ontario Teachers Union, the American Teachers Association. I mean, the teachers' union movement is irredeemably hard left wing. And Saskatchewan's the same. In fact, fun fact, the premier who succeeded Tommy Douglas, Woodrow Lloyd, was actually an executive in the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation and ran the union for years. So in Saskatchewan, the teachers union has always been a pretty solid NDP ally. So is it a coincidence that this thing hit impasse, hit these sorts of issues 6 months before an election? I didn't fall off the turnip truck yesterday, but I'm suspecting, there was a pretty hard political play. The government could not, and I don't think they will, give up the ability to run the school system. The teachers, and it was an odd bargaining position. We want more money, and the two sides were apart on money as they often are, but the teachers said, more important is we want in the teachers' union contract class size composition, the challenges of running individual schools. They wanted that bargained in as a teacher issue. Well, everybody knows school boards run school divisions run schools. The provincial legislature every year votes an appropriation for school expansion, school renovation, these things. So the teachers had really overreached. They were able to use a couple of collective agreements in British Columbia as evidence, but other than that, there's scant evidence a union should be running the workplace. So that was the impasse. But the union did very well, I thought, in positioning themselves as we're simply good, hardworking teachers who want a better environment for your kids. Pretty hard to rebut that. So I've given you the long explanation onto this whole question of class size and composition. You don't put that in a collective agreement. So it's now off at arbitration. The parties will try to find their way through it.
One of the other issues was a very weird controversy about an MLA being booted from cabinet, or he was government house leader, I believe, being booted from that position. Longtime ally of Scott Moe, one of Scott Moe's closest advisors, being removed from a position because he brought a gun into the legislature. Now, that sounds bad, and a lot of people go, oh, wow, how dare he? Of course, he's got to be fired. But there's weird internal party politics at play here, isn't there? I mean,
there is.
So let's unpack this. Jeremy Harrison, he's the guy that actually introduced me to Scott Moe years ago and said he'll be the next premier. I know Jeremy from his time in Ottawa when he was an MP. He's been around politics a long time. He's been an MLA for years after he lost his federal seat. What was he doing bringing a gun into the legislature, and how did it become a controversy that cost him his job?
This was a really peculiar story. Let me just go back a little bit. Jeremy Harrison did something that I think is indefensible. And like you, Jeremy Harrison's a friend of mine, and I think he's been a pretty effective cabinet minister and pretty senior MLA. For some inexplicable reason, and this is not the kind of thing I think that people should have their wits about them, he's the government house leader. He's unhappy with rulings the speaker makes. And welcome to real world. House leaders of the opposition, the government, are always getting cross-threaded with the speaker. So he texts, not just one or two, but dozens of texts. Really nasty things, dropping the F-bomb, accusing the speaker of basically being a congenital idiot. And now, the speaker, of course, is a Sask Party member. As our listeners will know, one of the MLAs gets chosen as the speaker, who's then the adjudicator of the debates. The speaker is an old-timey guy who'd been in cabinet briefly, Randy Weeks, a good rural MLA, not the most effective senior leader in government, becomes the speaker. Weeks, like a lot of very entitled rural MLAs, says, well, I'm going to run a few more times and get elected. Riding redistribution, his riding disappears. So Weeks looks over at a nearby riding that's become vacant, and I'll take that one. Well, a local farmer in that riding said, no, you won't. And as a contested nomination, Weeks loses. So Randy Weeks has no seat to run in. The sense was he believed the party should have said, Randy, you've been here, nearly 20 years. You're one of us. We'll look out for you. No, the party
So
said,
he wanted someone like Jeremy Harrison or Scott Moe to say, we'll protect your seat.
bingo, you new farmer running in this riding, step aside. You could have Randy Weeks. They didn't do it. They just let Randy fight his own battle. He lost. So all of a sudden, Randy Weeks is now a man who, as the session is expiring, once this session's over, he'll still be an MLA until the election's called, but he won't be an MLA anymore. So for some reason, and I don't know, I can't look inside people's minds, Randy Weeks, toward the end of the session, says, I want to say a few things. Begins to read these texts verbatim. And again, I felt, like, who in the modern world would send anyone a text knowing it could be on the front page of the paper? It could be shared publicly. So Jeremy Harrison, I think, wears that. I don't think it was behavior fitting of a government house leader. I would think Jeremy should be above that. So he wears it. Randy Weeks continues to go down this road and says, I'm very concerned about this person and his stability, and then begins to sort of paint him as a gun nut. Now, Jeremy Harrison is a sport shooter. He's a hunter. He's a gun owner. Well,
He's not a
this
gun
just
nut, though. Not in my experience.
this just in, Sherlock, several 100,000 people in Saskatchewan are sport shooters and hunters. So then, and Weeks goes on, and you'd appreciate this because I know you know about guns. Weeks says he owns guns that are military assault style weapons. So he uses the Trudeau term, right? And they have magazines of 4 bullets.
But that's
Actually,
legal.
the law is 5.
Yeah.
But sorry, Randy. Okay, don't let me get in the way. That could be modified to be used as assault style. So he goes on, and I'm thinking every person who has a rifle in their gun safe is listening to this thinking, what the hell are you saying? But then he says, and he brought a gun into the legislature. So then the story is apparently on a hunting sojourn, uh, Harrison ends up bringing a gun to work. Now, we joked about this because there's a lot of workplaces in Saskatchewan. People will bring a gun in a case during hunting season and say, hey, after work today, we're going out duck hunting. But the legislative precincts are different. So then there becomes a question. First of all, the response to the government is this is fabricated nonsense, completely made up. Well, Jeremy Harrison remembers that 8 years ago he did bring a gun during hunting season. So then he has to back up. Then, well, did he leave the gun with the sergeant at arms? Did he bring it into his office? And then the analysis begins. But if you believe guns are frightening things used in mass shootings by a cabinet minister, maybe Jeremy Harrison was intent. Oh, and then the media found he was wearing camo on that day. And we all
Because he
know that
was going hunting.
going hunting. Exactly. So a lot of inside the gun community, there was sort of this general sense, this is wacky, but it made the government look bad. It made Harrison look bad. And to a lot of people who don't own guns, what the heck are you doing bringing a gun to work?
So really, let's boil this down to its essence. This is internal party politics of these two guys fighting. And then Scott Moe has to adjudicate and basically says, okay, Harrison, you're out for now because I don't want the headache heading into an election.
Yes, and maybe don't text the speaker in future. So again, he was stripped as House Leader, which he should have been, because if you've got a House Leader, dropping f-bombs to the speaker, I don't care who you are. That's wrong.
But so it was more the texts than the gun thing.
I think that's what precipitated it. But Weeks, by going on this gun thing, went down a road that I thought was. Oh yeah, and that was the other one too. When Saskatchewan passed the Firearms Act, there's a lot of heckling back and forth. And he said, I heard the House Leader say, I want to be able to have a carry permit for a gun. So he wants a handgun on top of it all. And I remember thinking, that seemed to be a stretch because we don't have people typically, as you know, to get a permit to carry a handgun in Canada is a pretty rare thing. So that got into it too. But here was Randy Weeks, rural MLA, very rural, sort of trying to get the urban anti-gun lobby to ratchet up the concerns. So it was a peculiar thing.
So the election is October. What happens?
It'll be late October if Saskatchewan adheres to the 4-year set election dates. There will be some challenges for the Sask Party. There are several urban seats that they're going to have to fight the NDP hard on. They may lose. You start to look at the seat constellation in the rural areas. I don't see the NDP gaining a seat. I see the NDP challenging in several seats, both in Regina and Saskatoon. But in Saskatchewan, the magic number is 31 seats. That's, of course, it's in a 61 seat House. 31 is a majority. When you count the rural seats up, you're already at about 32, 33. So that would assume no urban seats. And the Sask Party clearly will be returned in suburban seats. So when you do the math, you're still in that range of high 30s to 40ish.
Well, it's going to be a fascinating time, and we'll be watching eagerly from Toronto. John, thanks for the time today.
Brian, always great connecting, my friend, and thanks for having me.
Full Comment is a post-media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Prue. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. You can subscribe to Full Comment on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube Podcasts is a new one. Listen through any Alexa-enabled device. Help us out by giving us a rating or leaving a review. And make sure you tell your friends about us. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.